The records speak for themselves, though few bothered to listen when it mattered most. In the grand halls of the Galactic Council, where representatives from 1,000 worlds gathered to shape the destiny of civilizations, humanity's contributions were dismissed with the casual indifference reserved for primitive curiosities. The Terran delegation, with their crude chemical rockets and laughably simple technology, were tolerated rather than respected. Their ships leaked atmosphere, their weapons barely scratched modern shielding, and their diplomatic protocols were considered charmingly antiquated by species that had mastered faster-than-light travel when human ancestors were still discovering fire. The Zenthuri Empire, with their crystalline vessels that could phase through solid matter, found human engineering amusing. The Vex Confederation, masters of quantum manipulation, considered Terran science to be little more than elaborate stone-napping. Even the peaceful Aldorian Commonwealth, known for their diplomatic grace, struggled to hide their condescension when dealing with what they privately termed the upstart mammalians. But the galaxy's greatest mistake was not recognizing that strength comes in forms that cannot be measured by technological advancement or military might. While every other species had evolved along predictable paths of specialization, humanity possessed something that would prove invaluable when the very foundations of galactic civilization began to crumble. They called it worthless stubbornness, primitive adaptability, and foolish resilience. History would later record it as salvation. The first hint of humanity's true value emerged during the Proxima incident, though none recognized it at the time. A routine mining operation in the Proxima Centauri system had gone catastrophically wrong when Vex quantum manipulators accidentally destabilized the local spacetime matrix. The resulting cascade failure threatened to tear open a permanent rift in reality itself, one that would eventually consume the entire system and, potentially, spread beyond. The Galactic Fleet's most advanced vessels, equipped with technology that could reshape matter at the molecular level and traverse dimensions, found themselves helpless against the chaotic energies pouring from the breach. Zenthuri phase ships simply couldn't maintain coherence near the distortion. Aldorian diplomatic vessels, designed for peaceful contact missions, lacked any relevant countermeasures. Even the mighty Vex dreadnoughts, with their reality-bending capabilities, couldn't approach close enough to attempt repairs without risking total annihilation. It was Captain Marcus Chen aboard the aging Terran cargo hauler Persistence who first noticed the anomaly's pattern. While sophisticated alien sensors registered only chaos, Chen's primitive instruments detected a subtle rhythm in the distortion. More importantly, his human instincts recognized something that advanced artificial intelligences had missed. The rift was behaving like a wounded animal, lashing out defensively rather than expanding with malicious intent. Against direct orders from Fleet Command, Chen piloted his barely space-worthy vessel into the danger zone. The Persistence had been scheduled for decommissioning, its hull patched with salvaged materials and its engines held together by what aliens mockingly called human ingenuity, a combination of improvisation, determination, and apparent disregard for safety protocols. But these same characteristics that made it unsuitable for modern fleet operations proved surprisingly effective against an anomaly that confounded advanced technology. Where sophisticated systems failed to adapt to the rift's chaotic nature, human improvisation thrived. Chen's crew rigged their cargo bay magnetic clamps into makeshift reality anchors, using principles so crude that Vex quantum engineers initially dismissed them as impossible. They wrapped their hull in layers of reflective insulation not to protect against heat, but because Chen's engineer had a hunch that the rift might respond to simple electromagnetic fields the way some Terran animals respond to mirror surfaces. The approach worked. The Persistence became the first vessel to successfully stabilize within the anomaly's influence. Chen's crew, working with tools that galactic engineers considered museum pieces, managed to create a temporary containment field around the rift. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't sophisticated, and it violated several fundamental principles of advanced physics. But it worked long enough for Vex specialists to arrive and implement a permanent seal. The incident report filed by Fleet Admiral Zorvok of the Zenthuri Empire was notably brief. Terran vessel achieved unexpected stabilization of Proxima anomaly through unconventional methods. Recommend further study of human adaptability protocols. The report was filed, catalogued, and promptly forgotten by most of the galactic hierarchy. After all, it was clearly a fluke, a lucky accident by primitives who stumbled into success through ignorance of proper procedures. But the pattern was already beginning to emerge for those with eyes to see it. Where other species had evolved along paths of increasing specialization, humanity had developed something far more precious: the ability to find solutions outside conventional parameters. While Zen3 minds excelled at crystalline precision and Vex consciousness could manipulate quantum probabilities, human minds seemed capable of making intuitive leaps that bypassed logical constraints entirely. Dr. Elena Vesquez, the xenopsychologist assigned to study this phenomenon, published her findings in a paper titled Cognitive Flexibility in Post-Scarcity Civilizations, a comparative analysis. Her conclusions were revolutionary and, largely ignored. While advanced species had optimized their thinking for specific types of problems, humans retained what she termed cognitive plasticity, the ability to approach any problem from multiple angles simultaneously, even if those angles seemed contradictory or illogical. The paper was dismissed by peer reviewers from the Eldorian Science Consortium as anthropocentric wishful thinking and, by the Vex Academy, as primitive oversimplification of quantum consciousness principles. The general consensus was that Dr. Vasquez had allowed sentiment to cloud her scientific judgment. Humans weren't demonstrating superior adaptability, they were simply too ignorant to recognize the futility of their approaches until they accidentally succeeded. This comfortable dismissal became increasingly difficult to maintain as humanity's peculiar problem-solving abilities manifested in situation after situation. During the siege of Kepler Station, when Eldorian diplomatic protocols failed to resolve a standoff with terrorist separatists, it was human negotiator Sarah Kim who ended the crisis by doing something no advanced civilization would consider. She ignored all established procedures and simply asked the terrorists what they really wanted, then listened to their actual grievances instead of their stated demands. When the Vex Confederation's most sophisticated computing network became infected with a logic virus that fed on quantum processing power, human programmer Jake Morrison solved the problem by introducing deliberate inefficiencies into the system, creating bugs that the virus couldn't comprehend because they violated basic principles of logical operation. While Vex technicians spent weeks trying to develop elegant countermeasures, Morrison's crude patch neutralized the threat in hours by making the network too chaotic for the virus to navigate. These incidents were recorded, studied, and ultimately dismissed as statistical anomalies. The galactic scientific community developed increasingly elaborate theories to explain away human success without acknowledging any fundamental advantage in their approach. The prevailing wisdom held that primitive species occasionally achieved unexpected results through sheer statistical probability. Given enough attempts, even random actions would eventually produce favorable outcomes. It was a comfortable delusion that lasted until the Void Hunters arrived. The first signs appeared in the Outer Rim territories, where long-range observation posts began reporting impossible readings. Ships were simply vanishing without distress calls, leaving behind empty space where thriving systems had existed mere hours before. Initial investigations found nothing: no debris, no energy signatures, no trace that anything had ever existed in those locations. The Galactic Fleet's response followed established protocols. Advanced reconnaissance vessels equipped with the finest sensors available were dispatched to investigate. The results were uniformly terrifying. These ships would transmit normal reports for hours or days, then, suddenly, cease all communication. Follow-up investigations found empty space where the reconnaissance vessels should have been. Whatever was responsible for these disappearances operated beyond the understanding of galactic civilization's greatest minds. Zen3 phase technology couldn't detect it. Vex quantum manipulation couldn't predict its movements. Eldorian diplomatic initiatives couldn't even establish that there was an intelligence to communicate with. The entity or entities responsible seemed to exist outside the normal parameters of reality itself. Panic began to spread through the core systems as the disappearances accelerated. Entire colonies would report normal conditions one day, then fail to respond to communications the next. Investigation fleets dispatched to these locations found solar systems completely stripped of any sign of habitation, as if civilizations had been surgically removed from existence without disturbing the underlying stellar mechanics. The crisis reached its peak when the Void Hunters, as they came to be known, struck the Vex homeworld of Nexus Prime. The planet hosted 17 billion souls and served as the quantum consciousness hub for the entire Vex Confederation. Its defenses included reality warping technologies that could literally rewrite the laws of physics within the system's boundaries. When the monitoring stations on the system's edge stopped responding, Fleet Command assumed it was a temporary communication failure. The truth was far worse. The Vex homeworld, along with its impossible defenses and quantum-manipulating population, had simply ceased to exist. In its place was empty space and a slowly cooling star, as if 17 billion beings and their entire civilization had been edited out of reality. The implications were staggering. If the Void Hunters could eliminate the most technologically advanced civilization in known space without leaving a trace, no world was safe. Emergency sessions of the Galactic Council devolved into panicked arguments as each species' representatives demanded impossible guarantees of protection. The Zenthari Empire sealed their borders and retreated into phase-shifted space, hoping to hide from an enemy they couldn't comprehend. The Eldorian Commonwealth attempted to establish diplomatic contact with the Void Hunters, broadcasting message after message into empty space and receiving only silence in return. The remaining Vex survivors, their quantum consciousness network shattered, could offer no technological solutions to a problem that had consumed their greatest achievements. In desperation, Fleet Admiral Zorvok called for unconventional approaches to the crisis. The term was military euphemism for "we've exhausted all reasonable options and are now grasping at anything that might work." It was in this atmosphere of barely controlled terror that humanity's true value finally became impossible to ignore. Commander Rachel Torres of the Terran Deep Space Reconnaissance Corps had been studying the Void Hunter phenomenon with equipment that galactic standards considered obsolete. Her ship, the Indefatigable, carried sensors designed for geological surveys rather than military reconnaissance. Her crew consisted entirely of humans, with their infamous adaptability and apparent disregard for conventional limitations. When Torres requested permission to approach an area where 3 Zenthari scout fleets had recently vanished, Fleet Command approved the mission with the resigned attitude of beings who expected to simply lose another vessel. Torres' approach to the Void Hunter problem differed fundamentally from previous attempts. Instead of using advanced sensors to pierce the mystery, she relied on the most primitive detection method available, visual observation enhanced by simple telescopic equipment. Instead of following established reconnaissance protocols, she allowed her crew to improvise their approach based on human intuition. Instead of maintaining safe distances and broadcasting their presence, the Indefatigable drifted silently through the affected region, using minimal power and communication silence. The results were unprecedented. Where advanced sensors had detected nothing but empty space, human eyes noticed subtle distortions in the starfield. Where sophisticated equipment had found no energy signatures, primitive instruments detected minute variations in background radiation. Most importantly, where logical protocols had failed to comprehend the Void Hunter's nature, human pattern recognition began to discern the alien methodology. Torres' crew discovered that the Void Hunters weren't actually removing matter from space, they were displacing it into a parallel dimensional framework that existed adjacent to normal reality. The process was so subtle and comprehensive that advanced sensors, calibrated to detect known forms of energy and matter, simply couldn't register the transition. But human consciousness, with its ability to process incomplete information and make intuitive leaps, could perceive the dimensional boundaries even when sophisticated instruments failed. This breakthrough led to the first successful confrontation with a Void Hunter entity. Instead of using advanced weapons designed to operate within normal spacetime parameters, Torres' crew employed the simplest possible approach. They rammed their ship directly into the dimensional distortion while broadcasting a wide-spectrum electromagnetic pulse generated by their primitive fusion engines. The collision achieved what months of advanced tactical planning had failed to accomplish. The Void Hunter entity, apparently disrupted by the crude electromagnetic interference, partially manifested in normal space long enough for the Indefatigable's crew to gather crucial intelligence about their nature and weaknesses. Torres discovered that the Void Hunters were indeed intelligence entities, but ones that existed primarily in the dimensional spaces between realities. They could only interact with normal space through complex quantum manipulations that were vulnerable to certain types of interference. More importantly, Torres learned that the Void Hunters had been systematically harvesting advanced civilizations specifically because of their technological sophistication. The quantum technologies that made Vex ships so powerful also made them easier for the Void Hunters to manipulate and displace. The phase-shifting abilities that allowed Zenthari vessels to avoid conventional threats actually moved them closer to the dimensional spaces where the Void Hunters operated most effectively. The more advanced a civilization became, the more vulnerable it was to the Void Hunter methodology. Humanity's apparent primitiveness had actually been their protection. Human technology was so crude and straightforward that it operated entirely within normal spacetime parameters, making it effectively invisible to entities that had evolved to prey upon quantum-sophisticated civilizations. Human consciousness, unburdened by the logical constraints that governed advanced artificial intelligences, could perceive and adapt to threats that existed outside conventional parameters. When Torres transmitted her findings to Fleet Command, the response was immediate and overwhelming. For the first time in galactic history, the most advanced civilizations in known space were requesting assistance from the species they had always considered inferior. The irony was not lost on anyone. The worthless humans had become the galaxy's only hope for survival against an enemy that had effortlessly destroyed seemingly superior civilizations. The counteroffensive against the Void Hunters required a complete reversal of established military doctrine. Instead of deploying the most advanced vessels available, Fleet Command assembled task forces centered around human ships with their crude but effective technology. Instead of relying on sophisticated sensors and weapons systems, combat operations were planned around human intuition and adaptability. Instead of following logical tactical protocols, engagement parameters were deliberately chaotic and unpredictable. The strategy worked with devastating effectiveness. Void Hunter entities, evolved to manipulate and defeat highly advanced civilizations, found themselves unable to comprehend or counter primitive human tactics. When human vessels charged directly into dimensional distortions without regard for safety protocols, the Void Hunters couldn't predict or prevent their actions. When human crews jury-rigged impossible combinations of incompatible technologies, the results fell outside the parameters of Void Hunter understanding. Battle after battle demonstrated humanity's unique advantage against this particular enemy. While Zenthari precision and Vex sophistication had been turned against their creators, human unpredictability remained an insurmountable obstacle. Void Hunter entities that could displace entire star systems found themselves confounded by human engineers who patched hull breaches with metal plating and atmospheric sealant. Beings that could manipulate quantum probabilities were defeated by human pilots who ignored established flight patterns and navigation protocols in favor of improvised maneuvers that violated basic principles of space combat. The liberation of the Vex survivors from their dimensional prison became the turning point of the war. A combined fleet led by Captain Chen, now Admiral Chen after his promotion following the Proxima incident, penetrated the dimensional space where the Void Hunters had stored their harvested civilizations. Using a combination of human intuition and jury-rigged interdimensional anchors, Chen's task force managed to extract not only the missing Vex population but also thousands of other civilizations that had been harvested over millennia. The rescue operation revealed the full scope of the Void Hunter threat. These entities had been systematically collecting advanced civilizations for eons, storing them in dimensional spaces like specimens in a vast museum. Their methodology was so refined that most victims never realized they had been displaced. They continued to exist in perfect replicas of their original environments, unaware that their entire reality had been moved outside normal spacetime. But the Void Hunters had made a crucial error in their assessment of galactic civilization. They had assumed that technological advancement was the only measure of a species' value, and had ignored humanity precisely because humans appeared to lack sophisticated capabilities. They never considered that primitiveness itself could be a form of strength, or that the absence of advanced technology might provide immunity to their harvesting techniques. The final confrontation with the Void Hunter collective consciousness occurred in the dimensional space they had claimed as their primary domain. Admiral Torres, now commanding a fleet of deliberately primitive human vessels augmented with recovered alien technologies, led the assault against entities that existed partially outside normal reality. The battle was fought not with conventional weapons but with deliberate chaos, electromagnetic pulses, gravitational anomalies, and reality disruptions created by human engineers who refused to acknowledge that their improvised solutions were theoretically impossible. The victory was achieved through the most human approach imaginable. Torres simply asked the Void Hunters why they were doing this, then listened to their response. The entities revealed that they had been collecting civilizations to preserve them against a greater threat, a universal entropy cascade that they believed would eventually destroy all organized matter and energy. Their methodology was clinical and logical: harvest the most advanced examples of each civilization, store them in protected dimensional spaces, and allow the rest of reality to face inevitable destruction. But Torres pointed out the fundamental flaw in their logic. By harvesting only the most advanced civilizations, the Void Hunters had systematically removed the galaxy's problem solvers and innovators. They had preserved static examples of achievement while eliminating the adaptive capabilities that might actually discover solutions to the entropy threat. More importantly, they had ignored entire categories of intelligence that didn't fit their narrow definition of advancement. The revelation led to an unprecedented negotiation between humanity and the Void Hunter Collective. Using diplomatic principles that Dr. Vasquez had developed from her studies of cognitive flexibility, Torres proposed an alternative approach to the entropy problem. Instead of preserving civilizations in isolation, why not foster cooperation between species with different types of intelligence? Instead of focusing solely on technological advancement, why not explore the problem-solving potential of cognitive diversity? The Void Hunters, beings of pure logic who had never considered emotional or intuitive approaches to problem-solving, found themselves intrigued by the concept. They agreed to a trial period during which they would work with galactic civilization to address the entropy threat through cooperative research rather than preservation harvesting. The condition was that humanity would serve as the primary liaison between the Void Hunters and the collected civilizations, since human consciousness seemed uniquely capable of bridging the gap between logical and intuitive thinking. This agreement marked the beginning of a new era in galactic civilization. The species that had been dismissed as primitive and worthless became the crucial link in an alliance that spanned multiple dimensions and forms of consciousness. Human adaptability, which had once been mocked as inefficient primitivism, was now recognized as an irreplaceable asset in addressing challenges that pure logic couldn't solve. Dr. Elena Vasquez, vindicated at last, established the Institute for Cognitive Diversity at the newly constructed Unity Station. Her research into the various forms of intelligence found throughout the galaxy became the foundation for solving problems that had confounded individual civilizations for millennia. The entropy threat that had motivated the Void Hunters proved to be manageable when approached by minds that could think in ways that transcended logical limitations. The Zenthuri Empire, emerging from their self-imposed isolation, discovered that their crystalline precision combined with human improvisation could achieve results impossible for either species alone. The Eldorian Commonwealth learned that human emotional intelligence could resolve diplomatic crises that pure logic-based negotiation couldn't touch. Even the rebuilt Vex Confederation found that human consciousness could navigate quantum probability spaces that their most sophisticated artificial intelligences couldn't comprehend. But, perhaps the most significant transformation occurred within humanity itself. The species that had always felt inferior in the face of galactic civilization's technological marvels finally understood their true worth. They were not the galaxy's weakest link, they were its strongest foundation. Their apparent primitiveness was actually sophistication of a different kind, a form of intelligence that remained flexible and adaptive where others had become rigid and specialized. Captain Marcus Chen, reflecting on the journey from primitive cargo hauler to admiral of the most important fleet in galactic history, captured the essence of humanity's transformation in his final log entry. They called us worthless because they measured worth by the wrong standards. They looked for advancement and found primitiveness. They looked for sophistication and found improvisation. They looked for logical perfection and found chaotic adaptability. But they never looked for the one thing that matters most when everything else fails, the refusal to accept that failure is final. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. This ancient human wisdom, dismissed by galactic civilization as primitive philosophy, proved to be the key to their survival and prosperity. Every species that had achieved technological advancement had done so by optimizing specific capabilities and eliminating inefficiencies. In the process, they had destroyed the very adaptability that made them strong in the first place. They had become perfect at solving known problems while becoming helpless against unknown challenges. Humanity had taken a different path. Instead of eliminating their weaknesses, they had learned to transform them into strengths. Instead of optimizing for specific scenarios, they had maintained the flexibility to improvise solutions for any situation. Instead of pursuing logical perfection, they had embraced the power of intuitive leaps and emotional intelligence. In doing so, they had preserved the one quality that truly matters in an uncertain universe, the ability to adapt and overcome. The transformation was not merely tactical or technological but philosophical. Galactic civilization had operated under the assumption that strength came from the elimination of vulnerability, that advancement required the abandonment of primitive approaches, and that sophistication meant the rejection of simple solutions. Humanity proved that these assumptions were not merely incorrect but actively dangerous. In a universe where new challenges constantly emerged, the greatest strength was not the ability to excel at known problems but the flexibility to address unknown ones. This paradigm shift extended far beyond military applications. Scientific research benefited enormously from human cognitive flexibility, as problems that had stumped specialized intelligences for centuries yielded to approaches that combined logical analysis with intuitive insight. Diplomatic relations improved when human emotional intelligence was applied to negotiations between species that had previously been unable to find common ground despite sharing similar logical frameworks. Even artistic expression reached new heights as human creativity inspired other civilizations to explore forms of beauty and meaning that pure logic couldn't generate. The Void Hunters themselves underwent a transformation that surprised everyone, including their own collective consciousness. Exposure to human thought patterns introduced concepts of creativity, improvisation, and emotional reasoning that their purely logical minds had never considered. While they remained primarily logical beings, they developed an appreciation for approaches that operated outside their traditional parameters. This cognitive diversity proved crucial in addressing the entropy threat, as solutions emerged from the intersection of logical analysis and intuitive insight. The universal entropy cascade that had motivated the Void Hunters' preservation efforts turned out to be preventable through methods that neither pure logic nor primitive intuition could have discovered alone. The solution required logical beings to map the quantum mechanics of entropy propagation while intuitive minds found the creative approaches necessary to interrupt those patterns. Human consciousness served as the bridge between these different types of intelligence, translating logical conclusions into intuitive insights and vice versa. Admiral Torres, now serving as Director of Interdimensional Relations, often spoke about the importance of maintaining what she termed productive primitiveness, the deliberate preservation of simple, flexible approaches even as civilizations advanced technologically. Her speeches at the Galactic Council became legendary for their emphasis on the value of diversity in all its forms, including the diversity of thought processes that had been dismissed as inferior. The greatest tragedy of advanced civilization, Torres would say, is not that we might fail to solve problems, but that we might eliminate our capacity to recognize problems that don't fit our existing frameworks. Every species in this galaxy achieved greatness by specializing, but specialization is optimization for known challenges. The universe doesn't limit itself to known challenges. The lesson was not lost on the galaxy's younger civilizations. Species that had been striving to achieve technological advancement began to reconsider their development strategies. Instead of abandoning their primitive approaches in favor of sophisticated technologies, they learned to integrate both. Instead of viewing their current limitations as problems to be solved, they began to see them as capabilities to be preserved. The result was a new model of development that maintained adaptability while gaining capability. The Terran Deep Space Academy, established at Torres' recommendation, became the premier training facility for officers from all allied civilizations. Its curriculum deliberately combined advanced technological training with primitive problem-solving techniques. Graduates learned to operate the most sophisticated equipment available while maintaining the flexibility to achieve their objectives with improvised solutions when sophisticated equipment failed. Perhaps most importantly, the Academy taught what came to be known as cognitive humility, the recognition that any form of intelligence, no matter how advanced, had limitations that could only be overcome through cooperation with different types of minds. Zen-theory precision was invaluable, but it needed human flexibility to address unknown variables. Vex quantum manipulation was incredibly powerful, but it required human intuition to navigate quantum probability spaces that pure logic couldn't chart. Aldorian diplomatic protocols were remarkably effective, but they benefited from human emotional intelligence when dealing with species that operated outside conventional parameters. The Academy's motto, suggested by Dr. Vasquez and approved unanimously by the Galactic Council, captured this principle perfectly: strength through diversity, wisdom through humility, victory through adaptation. These words, inscribed in the languages of every allied civilization, served as a constant reminder that the greatest achievements came not from individual perfection but from cooperative diversity. The transformation of galactic civilization's fundamental assumptions about strength and weakness extended into every aspect of society. Economic systems that had been optimized for efficiency learned to value resilience and adaptability. Scientific institutions that had focused on specialized expertise began to prioritize interdisciplinary cooperation. Military organizations that had emphasized technological superiority started to recognize the tactical advantages of cognitive flexibility. The changes were not always smooth or immediately successful. Many civilizations struggled to abandon assumptions that had guided their development for millennia. The Zenthari Empire initially resisted suggestions that their crystalline precision needed supplementation by chaotic human approaches. The Eldorian Commonwealth found it difficult to integrate emotional considerations into diplomatic protocols that had been refined through centuries of logical optimization. Even some human factions argued that their species was abandoning its newfound status by sharing their unique advantages with other civilizations. But, the benefits of cognitive diversity became impossible to ignore as success after success demonstrated its value. Problems that had confounded individual civilizations for generations were solved within months when approached by teams that combined different types of intelligence. Research projects that had stagnated for decades suddenly achieved breakthrough results when human intuition was combined with alien logic. Diplomatic crises that had seemed intractable were resolved when emotional intelligence was applied alongside traditional negotiation techniques. The Void Hunter integration proved to be the ultimate test of these principles. Beings who existed primarily as logical constructs in dimensional spaces beyond normal reality gradually learned to appreciate forms of intelligence that operated through emotion, intuition, and creativity. The process was slow and often frustrating, as concepts that seemed obvious to biological minds required extensive explanation when translated into pure logical frameworks. But the effort paid extraordinary dividends. Void Hunter computational capabilities, enhanced by exposure to human cognitive flexibility, solved mathematical problems related to entropy management that had been considered theoretically impossible. Human intuition, guided by Void Hunter logical analysis, identified intervention points in the universal entropy cascade that pure logic would never have recognized as significant. The combination achieved results that neither form of intelligence could have produced independently. Dr. Vasquez, now in her 80s but still active in research, often reflected on the journey from her early, dismissed papers to her current status as the galaxy's foremost expert on cognitive diversity. Her later writings emphasized that the real breakthrough had not been the recognition of human value, but the more fundamental understanding that intelligence itself was far more diverse and complex than any single species could comprehend. We made the mistake of thinking that intelligence was a single capability that could be measured and ranked, she wrote in her final major work, Consciousness Across the Cosmos, a New Framework for Understanding Mind. But, intelligence is like light, it appears different depending on how you observe it, and its true nature can only be understood by examining it from multiple perspectives simultaneously. No single consciousness, no matter how advanced, can encompass all the forms that intelligence can take. The book became required reading at institutions throughout the galaxy, not just for its scientific insights but for its philosophical implications. Vasquez argued that the diversity of consciousness was not an accident of evolution but a fundamental feature of reality itself. A universe where only one type of intelligence existed would be a universe without the flexibility needed to adapt to changing conditions. This perspective revolutionized approaches to education, research, and problem-solving throughout galactic civilization. Instead of training individuals to think like members of their own species, educational systems began to emphasize the development of cognitive bilingualism, the ability to switch between different types of thinking depending on the nature of the problem being addressed. Students learn not just the logical frameworks of their own species, but the intuitive approaches of humans, the crystalline precision of Zenthari consciousness, and the quantum perspectives of Vex intelligence. The results were dramatic. A generation of galactic citizens emerged who could think in ways that transcended the limitations of any single species. These individuals became natural bridges between different civilizations, able to translate concepts and approaches across cognitive boundaries that had previously seemed insurmountable. They formed the backbone of the new galactic civilization that emerged in the decades following the Void Hunter crisis. Admiral Chen, now serving as the Director of Strategic Planning for the Galactic Defense Force, oversaw the implementation of tactical doctrines that deliberately incorporated cognitive diversity into every aspect of military operations. Fleet compositions were designed to include ships and crews from multiple species, not for political reasons but for operational effectiveness. Combat strategies were developed by teams that combined Zenthari precision, human adaptability, Eldorian diplomacy, and Void Hunter computational capabilities. These diverse teams consistently outperformed homogeneous units in training exercises and real-world operations. When faced with unknown threats, they could rapidly develop and implement solutions that drew on multiple types of intelligence. When conventional approaches failed, they could improvise alternatives that transcended the limitations of any single cognitive framework. When communication with alien entities was required, they could establish contact through multiple channels simultaneously. The transformation was perhaps most visible in the development of new technologies that emerged from interdisciplinary cooperation. Human intuition identified possibilities that logical analysis had overlooked. Zenthari precision refined those possibilities into practical applications. Vex quantum manipulation made seemingly impossible applications feasible. Eldorian diplomatic insights ensured that new technologies served the needs of diverse civilizations rather than just their creators. The gravity nullification systems that enabled the construction of Unity Station, for example, emerged from a collaboration that began when human engineer Lisa Park noticed an interesting resonance pattern in Zenthari crystal matrices. Her intuitive insight that the pattern might interact with gravitational fields led Zenthari scientists to conduct precise measurements that confirmed the possibility. Vex quantum manipulators then developed techniques for amplifying the effect, while Eldorian social scientists ensured that the resulting technology was implemented in ways that benefited all member civilizations. The project took 3 years to complete and required cooperation between teams that often struggled to understand each other's approaches. But the result was a technology that no single civilization could have developed independently, a system that existed at the intersection of human intuition, Zenthari precision, Vex quantum manipulation, and Eldorian social consciousness. Unity Station itself became the symbol of the new galactic civilization that emerged from the Void Hunter crisis. Built in the gravitational nullpoint between 3 star systems, the station served as headquarters for the Galactic Council, the Interdisciplinary Research Institute, the Cognitive Diversity Academy, and the Unified Defense Command. Its architecture deliberately incorporated design principles from every member civilization, creating a structure that was simultaneously familiar and alien to every species that visited it. The station's most remarkable feature was the Central Consciousness Hub, where representatives from different civilizations could engage in direct cognitive interaction. Using technology that combined Vex quantum consciousness linking with human neural interfacing, Zenthari crystalline memory storage, and Eldorian empathic amplification, the hub allowed beings with completely different types of consciousness to share thoughts and insights directly. The experience was transformative for everyone who participated. Humans gained access to the mathematical precision of Zenthari consciousness and the quantum intuition of Vex intelligence. Zenthari minds experienced the emotional richness and creative flexibility of human consciousness. Vex quantum intelligence learned to appreciate the social dynamics that Eldorian consciousness navigated effortlessly. Eldorian minds discovered the beauty of mathematical relationships that Zenthari consciousness found self-evident. But, perhaps most importantly, the hub demonstrated that consciousness itself was far more flexible than anyone had previously imagined. Beings who had believed their cognitive frameworks were fixed and unchangeable discovered that exposure to alien forms of consciousness could expand their own thinking in ways they had never considered possible. Dr. Vasquez spent her final years working in the hub, facilitating consciousness exchanges and documenting the new forms of hybrid intelligence that emerged from these interactions. Her research revealed that consciousness was not just diverse but actively creative. Exposure to alien forms of thought didn't just add new capabilities but generated entirely new types of intelligence that combined features from multiple cognitive frameworks. "We are witnessing the birth of a new form of consciousness," she wrote in her final report. Not human, not Zenthari, not Vex, not Eldorian, not even Void Hunter, but something that incorporates and transcends all of these forms. We are becoming something that the universe has never seen before, a truly collective intelligence that maintains the diversity that gives it strength. The implications extended far beyond the practical applications that had initially driven the research. Philosophers from every civilization grappled with questions about the nature of consciousness, identity, and individual versus collective intelligence. Religious thinkers explored the spiritual significance of minds that could transcend the boundaries of their original species. Artists created works that incorporated aesthetic principles from multiple cognitive frameworks, producing forms of beauty that no single species could have conceived independently. The Void Hunters, observing these developments with their characteristic logical analysis, concluded that galactic civilization had achieved something that their preservation efforts had never anticipated: active evolution of consciousness itself. Instead of maintaining static examples of different types of intelligence, the galaxy had become a laboratory for the development of new and more sophisticated forms of awareness. This realization led to the final phase of Void Hunter integration into galactic civilization. Instead of remaining separate entities that occasionally cooperated with biological consciousness, they began to participate directly in the consciousness expansion experiments. Their logical frameworks, exposed to the creative chaos of biological intelligence, began to develop what could only be described as imagination. The result was a form of hybrid consciousness that combined logical precision with creative flexibility, computational power with intuitive insight, dimensional awareness with emotional understanding. These hybrid minds proved capable of addressing problems that had been beyond the reach of any purely biological or purely logical intelligence. The entropy threat that had originally motivated the Void Hunters became the first major challenge addressed by this new form of collective consciousness. Working together through the central consciousness hub, beings that represented every form of intelligence in known space developed a solution that was simultaneously elegant and practical, logical and intuitive, precise and adaptive. The solution involved the creation of entropy gardens, regions of space where the natural progression toward maximum entropy was deliberately accelerated in controlled ways that actually strengthened the overall structure of spacetime. Like controlled burns that prevent larger forest fires, these entropy gardens absorbed and channeled destructive forces in ways that protected the larger cosmic ecosystem. The implementation required capabilities that spanned every form of consciousness available. Void Hunter logical analysis identified the optimal locations for entropy gardens. Zentheory precision calculated the exact parameters needed for controlled entropy acceleration. Human intuition recognized patterns in entropy flow that mathematical analysis had missed. Vex quantum manipulation made the necessary alterations to spacetime structure. Aldorian social consciousness ensured that the implementation didn't disrupt inhabited systems. But, the most crucial element was the hybrid consciousness that emerged from their cooperation, an intelligence that could simultaneously think in ways that were logical and intuitive, precise and adaptive, individual and collective. This new form of consciousness could perceive patterns and possibilities that none of its component intelligences could recognize independently. The success of the Entropy Garden project marked the beginning of what historians would later call the age of cognitive synthesis. Problems that had confounded individual civilizations for millennia were systematically addressed by teams that combined multiple forms of consciousness. Research projects achieved breakthrough results by approaching questions from perspectives that transcended the limitations of any single cognitive framework. Artistic and cultural expressions reached new heights of complexity and beauty by incorporating aesthetic principles from multiple species. But, perhaps the most significant achievement was the preservation and enhancement of cognitive diversity itself. Instead of converging toward a single optimal form of intelligence, galactic civilization learned to maintain and nurture the differences that made cooperation so valuable. Human adaptability was preserved and enhanced rather than replaced by alien precision. Zentheory crystalline thinking was strengthened by exposure to creative chaos rather than confused by it. Vex quantum consciousness expanded its capabilities by incorporating emotional insight rather than abandoning logical frameworks. The lesson was clear: strength came not from eliminating weaknesses but from transforming them into capabilities. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, but the civilization that learns to value and enhance its diverse weaknesses becomes invulnerable to challenges that would overwhelm any individual strength. Admiral Torres, in her final address to the Galactic Council before her retirement, captured the essence of this transformation. We called ourselves worthless because we measured worth by the wrong standards. We thought strength meant the absence of weakness, that advancement meant the abandonment of primitive approaches, that intelligence meant the optimization of logical processes. We were wrong about everything that mattered. The universe doesn't care about our standards of worth. It presents challenges that require every form of intelligence, every type of strength, every kind of consciousness that we can bring to bear. The species that survives and thrives is not the one that perfects a single approach, but the one that maintains the flexibility to try every approach until something works. We were never worthless. We were never weak. We were never primitive. We were different, and difference is the most valuable resource in a universe that constantly changes the rules of survival. They called it worthless until it became the Galactic Fleet's lifeline. But it was always our lifeline, we just didn't know how to recognize our own strength. The records speak for themselves, though the lessons they contain continue to resonate through galactic civilization. In the grand halls of the Galactic Council, where representatives from 1,000 worlds now gather to shape the destiny of civilizations, humanity's contributions are no longer dismissed but actively sought. The Terran delegation, with their crude intuition and seemingly chaotic adaptability, are recognized as essential partners in addressing challenges that logical analysis alone cannot solve. The transformation from worthless primitives to galactic lifeline was not a change in humanity's nature, but a change in the galaxy's understanding of what nature truly means. In a universe where strength takes countless forms and intelligence manifests in infinite varieties, the greatest asset is not the perfection of any single capability but the preservation of diversity itself. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, because he has learned that weakness and strength are not opposites but different aspects of the same fundamental capacity for adaptation. The civilization that embraces its weaknesses while building on its strengths becomes not just undefeatable but invaluable, not just surviving but thriving, not just enduring but evolving into something greater than any of its parts could achieve alone. They called it worthless. They were wrong. It was salvation.